We've heard a lot about the Indigenous peoples in Canada, but how many people really know about them, their joy and their struggles, especially regarding Indigenous women? In the recent years, the media has tackled and somewhat shed light on the risks of being an Indigenous woman in Canada. These women have suffered and continue to be victims of structural violence due to patriarchy dominance. From prior exposure to Indigenous societies, I've learned that their communities was once a matriarch society. Thereby, women of the elderly culture were known as the head of the families. They process knowledge of the cultures, ceremonies, and they make decisions for the community. However, this was pre-colonialism. Currently in Canada, violence against Indigenous women has been increasingly the main focus of the government. The government is aiming to provide more social justice for these women. Canada, in the eyes of the world, is a peaceful country and a safe haven. However, it has its flaws. Indigenous women, one should note, suffers from inequalities more than any other group of women. This group of women are subjected to a higher rate of violence, regardless of the form. In actuality, racialized violence aiming to these women are distributed due to the experience which are passed from one generation to another. For example, one form is violence in the form of gangs. This then leads to women disappearing and even being murdered. Such circumstances does not only affect victims, but also their families and friends. It is evident that the ways in which Indigenous peoples are representing Canada's history has an impact on how they are perceived and treated in the current society. Indigenous women were once regarded higher in the community because they possessed family line, utilized power, and were regarded as an authoritative figure in the decision-making process. Nonetheless, such attributes were seen as negative, therefore they were stripped of all the political powers they possessed in their communities when the Indian Act was introduced in Canada. The Indian Act was passed, which extended the powers of the state and imposed more stringent regulations, affecting all aspects of Indian life and Indian land management. Under this act, Indigenous women lost their status and were evicted from their reserves. They were also denied access to matrimonial property. This exemplifies the stereotypical notion that these primitive people have to be civilized, and eventually the imperialist notions of colonialism surfaced because Indigenous people, who were deemed to be wretched and barbaric and even demonic. However, the denial of these women's rights is a violation of the Bill of Rights, which forbids discrimination on sexism. The origin of violence could be argued as the result of the disposition of land and identity during the European invasion. Connection to the destruction, dismantling, and disruption of cultural systems, such as the destruction of traditional economies, breakdown of social structures and kinship systems, loss of languages, racial stereotyping, and removal of rights and responsibilities. Currently, there are various social issues embedded in this community. For instance, low socioeconomic status and high imprisonment rate, poor government services, lack of political recognition of rights, and many more. These aspects contribute to the psychological patterns that are of lack of self-esteem, anger, powerlessness, loss of spirituality, hopelessness, complacency. Cultural deprivation over centuries has negatively impacted communities to the point that violence has reached epidemic proportions and normalized and become a way of life for the Aboriginal people. One could assert the inequalities that Indigenous women endure make them vulnerable to violence compared to other non-Indigenous women. Hence, they're 3 times more likely to report any form of violence committed by their spouse or partner, and they're highly likely to be killed by their significant other after a separation. Violence as well as sexual assault imposed by a spouse or a stranger is a major offense to the human rights of women. Violence against these women is not an isolated incident. Rather, it's rooted in society's general attitudes reflected, which are widely distributed across institutions that are established to protect citizens, such as the police.